You had cereal this morning. Maybe a smoothie, maybe toast. Whatever it was, there's a good chance it came from a plant that didn't exist in its current form until a few thousand years ago. Grown in a field, harvested by a machine, and shipped to a store that stays open all night for reasons your ancestors would not understand. For roughly 2 million years, none of that existed. Humans ate whatever they could hunt, gather, or dig out of the ground that day. No bread, no rice, no pasta. If it wasn't moving, growing wild, or buried in dirt, it wasn't food. And it probably wasn't the diet you're picturing either. Forget the image of a hunter dramatically taking down a mammoth at sunset. Most of the calories in a hunter-gatherer diet came from plants, roots, tubers, nuts, seasonal fruit, and a lot of foraged greens that today's palate would probably turn down without a second thought. But hunter-gatherer diet is actually a misleading phrase because it implies there was just one. There wasn't. What people ate depended entirely on where they happened to live, and the differences were extreme. Take the Inuit of the Arctic. For most of the year, plants simply weren't an option. Their diet was built almost entirely around fat and protein, seal, whale, fish, and caribou, sometimes eaten raw to preserve nutrients that cooking would destroy. Researchers studying traditional Inuit diets found remarkably low rates of certain metabolic diseases despite an intake of fat that would make a modern nutritionist faint. The body, it turns out, can run on strikingly different fuel mixtures depending on what's actually available, and it adapts to that environment over generations. Now compare that to hunter-gatherer groups near the equator, where plant life is abundant year-round. There, diets leaned much more heavily on tubers, fruit, and nuts, with meat playing a smaller, more occasional role. Same species, same basic biology, completely different menu, shaped entirely by geography. This is part of why the modern idea of one single, correct ancestral diet doesn't really hold up. There wasn't a blueprint. There was improvisation, repeated successfully enough times to keep a population alive. Some of that improvisation gets left out of the highlight reel too. Insects, for example, were a genuinely significant food source across many hunter-gatherer societies, not a survival show gimmick. They're dense in protein and fat, and far easier to catch than a running animal. If your ancestors had access to a nutrient-rich food that didn't require a spear, a shopping cart, or a co-op membership, they took it. Bone marrow tells a similar story. Long before humans were particularly good hunters, evidence suggests early hominins were scavenging carcasses left by other predators, cracking open bones to get at the fat-rich marrow inside, one of the most calorie-dense foods available at the time. Some researchers argue this scavenged fat, more than any dramatic hunting scene, may have played a real role in fueling brain growth early in human evolution. Speaking of brain growth, cooking changed everything else that followed. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham has spent decades studying what actually shifted the trajectory of human evolution, and his research points somewhere unexpected. He argues that cooking, not meat itself, was the real turning point. Cooked food is easier to digest, which means more usable calories for less chewing. Less chewing meant smaller jaws over generations. Smaller jaws meant more room in the skull, and more room in the skull is part of how you ended up with a brain large enough to, say, worry about your inbox at 2 a.m. So somewhere back there, someone figured out that fire made root vegetables and scavenged fat easier to eat, and the ripple effects of that decision are still showing up in your skull today. They never got any credit for it either. No statue, no plaque, nothing. Here's where things get a little less flattering. Agriculture shows up around 12,000 years ago, which sounds like a long time until you compare it to the 2 million years that came before it. In evolutionary terms, farming is basically a new arrival. Your biology hasn't fully adjusted to it, and the transition itself wasn't the triumphant glow-up it's usually made out to be. Skeletal remains from early farming populations tell an inconvenient story. Bioarchaeologists, including work compiled by researcher George Armelagos, found that average height actually declined after groups shifted to agriculture, alongside a rise in dental problems, nutrient deficiencies, and infectious disease. The textbook image of a proud farmer holding up a stalk of wheat leaves out the part where everyone got shorter and their teeth got worse. So why switch at all? Because farming produced more total calories per acre of land, even if the food itself was less nutritious. More calories supported more people, and more people eventually built the surplus that led to cities, specialization, and several thousand years down the line, you, comfortably seated, evaluating their life choices from a couch. Not every population adapted to farming in the same way either. Take dairy. Most mammals lose the ability to digest lactose after infancy, and for most of human history, that included humans too. But in certain populations, particularly those with a long history of cattle herding in parts of Europe and Africa, a genetic mutation allowed adults to keep producing lactase, the enzyme that breaks down milk sugar, well into adulthood. That single mutation spread because it gave people access to a reliable new calorie source, and today it explains why some populations can down a glass of milk without consequence, while others feel it almost immediately. 12,000 years is enough time for evolution to make some changes. It is not enough time for it to make all of them evenly. There's a modern example that makes this even harder to ignore. The Hadza, a hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania, have been studied extensively by researcher Herman Ponser, whose work on their daily energy expenditure surprised a lot of people in the fitness world. Despite walking for miles every day and eating a diet completely different from a typical Western one, the Hadza's total daily energy expenditure turns out to be roughly similar to that of sedentary people in industrialized countries. Their bodies appear to simply regulate energy differently. Meanwhile, plenty of people today feel real accomplishment for closing 3 rings on a smartwatch. The Hadza diet itself isn't fixed either. It shifts by season, drawing primarily from honey, meat, baobab fruit, and tubers in different proportions depending on the time of year. There was never one single paleo diet. There were dozens of them, shaped entirely by geography and whatever happened to be available in that particular place at that particular time, which puts the modern grocery aisle in a slightly different light. Row after row of products labeled ancient grain, or paleo-inspired, as if scarcity and improvisation were a lifestyle brand instead of historically just how survival worked. The cravings you have for sugar and fat aren't a personal failing either. They're an old survival setting. In an environment where calorie-dense food was rare, craving it kept you alive long enough to pass on your genes. Wild honey, when your ancestors could find it, was essentially the equivalent of hitting the calorie jackpot, which is likely part of why humans still respond to sugar with such enthusiasm today. In an environment where sugar and fat are available at every gas station at any hour, that same craving doesn't serve the same purpose anymore. It just leads to a bag of chips and a bit of quiet regret in a parking lot. Researchers sometimes describe this as a mismatch. The same instinct that once ensured survival is now working against a very different environment, because the environment changed far faster than biology ever could. It's the same underlying story as the smoke detector in your brain that goes off over a text message. Different system, same basic pattern, and unfortunately, you're the one dealing with the consequences. So the next time you're feeling good about a green smoothie, it's worth remembering that your ancestors would likely take one look at it, and then ask why you're drinking blended grass when there's probably a perfectly good root or a very good piece of bone marrow buried somewhere nearby. You're not really eating like your ancestors did. Nobody fully can, because there was never one diet to copy in the first place. Just a few million years of people figuring out what worked with whatever the land in front of them happened to offer. You're eating like someone who read one article about them and then went right back to cereal for dinner, and honestly, that's fine. Just maybe give the root vegetables and the bone marrow their due credit every once in a while.